The snow had buried everything except the truth. Thomas Rollins stood before the massive barn doors, his hands trembling not from the cold, but from what he had just discovered inside the supposedly worthless ranch he had inherited. The rusty padlock that should have secured decades of neglect lay broken at his feet, yet the doors showed no signs of forced entry. Inside, beneath layers of carefully arranged hay bales, equipment gleamed with the kind of care that suggested recent use. But according to every neighbor he had met, his uncle Jeremiah had been too poor to afford even basic repairs. The contradiction made no sense. Nothing about this place made sense. Thomas had arrived 3 days earlier with a simple plan: assess the property, sell it quickly, and return to his comfortable life in the Eastern Territories. The lawyer's letter had been clear about his uncle's financial situation. Jeremiah Rollins had died owing money to half the county, leaving behind nothing but a worthless tract of land buried under winter storms. The neighbors had been equally clear. Virgil Granger, who owned the adjacent spread, had approached him within hours of his arrival with an offer to buy the land for enough to cover the funeral expenses and little more. A generous gesture, Granger had called it, considering the ranch's reputation. Yet here Thomas stood, staring at evidence that contradicted everything he had been told. The equipment hidden beneath the hay was not only functional, but expensive. Precision tools, surveying instruments, and machinery that would cost more than most ranchers earned in several seasons. The barn itself, despite its weathered exterior, had been reinforced with new timber. Recent work, judging by the lack of weathering on the cuts. He pulled one of the surveying instruments from its hiding place and examined it closely. The brass fittings showed no sign of age or disuse. Someone had been caring for these tools, using them regularly. But for what purpose? The ranch stretched across barren hills with little obvious value. No mineral deposits were known in the area, no water rights worth mentioning, no particular advantage for cattle or crops. A sound outside made him freeze. Footsteps crunched through the snow, approaching the barn with deliberate slowness. Thomas quickly replaced the instrument and arranged the hay bales to conceal his discovery. The footsteps stopped just outside the doors, but whoever stood there in the snow remained silent, waiting. And Thomas began to understand that his inheritance came with watchers who expected him to see only what they wanted him to see. Thomas pressed himself against the inner wall of the barn, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. The footsteps had stopped, but he could sense someone's presence just beyond the wooden doors. Waiting, listening. He counted the seconds, each one stretching longer than the last, until finally the footsteps resumed, moving away from the barn and toward the main house. He waited several more minutes before carefully pushing one of the barn doors open, just enough to peer outside. Fresh boot prints led from the barn to the house, then continued around to the back where they disappeared into the tree line. Someone had been watching him, had seen him enter the barn, and had chosen not to confront him directly. The realization sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the winter air. Back inside the house, Thomas built up the fire and tried to make sense of what he had discovered. The house itself told the same story as the barn's exterior. Everything suggesting a man who had struggled financially. Mismatched furniture, patched curtains, dishes that had seen better years. Yet someone had been maintaining the barn's contents with meticulous care. Someone who knew about the hidden equipment and wanted to keep it hidden. A knock at the front door interrupted his thoughts. Thomas opened it to find Cora Lane, the woman from the general store who had been kind enough to bring him supplies when he first arrived. She held a steaming pot wrapped in cloth. "Thought you might appreciate some hot stew," she said, her eyes avoiding his. "Weather's getting worse. Storm's supposed to last through tomorrow." Thomas accepted the pot gratefully, but noticed how her gaze kept shifting to the barn visible through the window. "Did you know my uncle well, Miss Lane?" "Well enough," she replied, still not meeting his eyes. "Jeremiah was a private man, kept to himself mostly." She paused, then added quietly, "Some folks around here think you'd be smart to take Virgil's offer and leave before the roads get any worse." "What aren't you telling me?" Thomas asked directly. Cora finally looked at him and he saw something that might have been fear in her expression. "Your uncle wasn't the poor man everyone claims he was, but asking too many questions about how he really made his living." She glanced toward the barn again. "Well, let's just say some secrets are buried deep for good reason." She turned to leave, then stopped. "That storm's not the only thing you should be worried about tonight, Thomas. Lock your doors." As her figure disappeared into the swirling snow, Thomas realized his inheritance was far more complicated than anyone had wanted him to know. Thomas secured the door locks and drew the curtains, but sleep proved impossible. Every sound outside made him wonder if someone was circling the house, testing for weaknesses. The storm had intensified, wind howling through the gaps in the wooden walls, but beneath the natural sounds he heard something else, the deliberate crunch of boots moving around the property's perimeter. He extinguished the lamp and moved to the back window, peering through a gap in the curtains. A lantern's glow bobbed between the trees, too steady to be carried by someone walking normally. Whoever held it was moving with purpose, following a specific path through the woods behind the barn. The light paused at several locations, as if the carrier was checking predetermined points. When dawn finally broke, Thomas discovered more than just footprints in the snow. Someone had attempted to pry open the barn's side door during the night. Fresh scratches marked the wood around the lock, and metal shavings lay scattered in the snow below. They had failed to gain entry, but the attempt confirmed his growing suspicion that the barn's contents were valuable enough to risk theft. A rider approached the house just after sunrise. Virgil Granger dismounted and tied his horse to the porch rail with casual familiarity, as if he had made this journey many times before. Thomas opened the door before Granger could knock. "Rough night," Granger said, brushing snow from his coat. "Storm knocked down trees across the main road. You'll be stuck here for at least another day." His eyes drifted toward the barn. "Good thing I brought a better offer for the property." Thomas studied the man's face. "What makes you think I'm interested in selling?" "Practical considerations," Granger replied. "Place like this costs more to maintain than it's worth. Your uncle learned that the hard way." He pulled a folded paper from his coat. "This offers 3 times what I proposed before, enough to set you up comfortable back east." The sudden increase in price raised more questions than it answered. "What changed your mind about the property's value?" Granger's expression hardened slightly. "Let's say I'd rather see it in friendly hands than have it sit empty, attracting the wrong kind of attention." He gestured toward the barn. "Some folks might come looking for things that aren't their concern, things better left undisturbed." Thomas realized that Granger knew exactly what lay hidden in the barn. "What kind of things?" "The kind that got your uncle into trouble with people who don't forgive debts," Granger said quietly. "Take the offer, Thomas. Pack your things and leave today, even if you have to ride through the storm." But as Granger spoke, Thomas noticed something that chilled him more than the winter air. The boots the man wore matched exactly the prints he had seen circling the house during the night. Thomas kept his expression neutral despite the revelation. "I appreciate your concern, Virgil, but I'm not ready to make any decisions about selling." Granger's jaw tightened. "You don't understand the situation you've inherited. Your Uncle Jeremiah wasn't just running a ranch. He was surveying federal land for a mining consortium, mapping mineral deposits that the government doesn't know exist yet. Those instruments in the barn are worth more than the land itself, but they belong to men who kill to protect their investments." The admission confirmed Thomas's suspicions, but raised new questions about why Granger was revealing this information. "If you know about the mining survey, you must have been involved." "I helped transport equipment, nothing more," Granger said. "But when Jeremiah died suddenly, the consortium assumed he had hidden their survey data somewhere on the property. They're coming to retrieve it, and they won't care who gets in their way." Thomas felt pieces of the puzzle sliding into place. The night visits, the attempted break-in. "You've been searching for the survey maps yourself." Granger's hand moved closer to the pistol on his hip. "I've been trying to protect you from making a fatal mistake. Those men arrive tomorrow, storm or no storm. They'll tear this place apart looking for what Jeremiah hid, and if you're still here when they find it, then help me find it first," Thomas interrupted. "If the survey data is what they want, we can negotiate from a position of strength instead of running." "You're talking about stealing from people who've already killed 3 men over this operation," Granger said. "The smart play is to take their money and disappear." But Thomas had spent the morning thinking about his uncle's situation, and a different picture was emerging. What if Jeremiah wasn't stealing from them? What if he discovered something they didn't want documented? Granger went very still. "What do you mean?" "A man doesn't hide expensive equipment under hay bales unless he's protecting it from the people who gave it to him," Thomas said. "Maybe Jeremiah found something the consortium wanted to keep secret, something worth more than a mining survey." "Even if that's true, it doesn't change your situation," Granger replied. "Dead men can't spend discovery money." Through the window, Thomas saw riders approaching through the storm. 3 men on horseback, moving with military precision despite the weather conditions. They were still half a mile away, but even at that distance, Their intent was unmistakable. "Looks like your timeline was optimistic," Thomas said quietly. "They're already here." Granger cursed and moved to the window. "That's impossible. The roads are completely blocked." He studied the approaching riders with growing alarm. Unless they know another way through the mountains, which meant they had been operating in this area long enough to learn the terrain thoroughly, and they were confident enough in their claim to the property to travel through dangerous weather to retrieve what they considered theirs. The lead rider's horse snorted as they approached the house, its breath forming white clouds in the frigid air. Thomas heard the leather creak as the men dismounted, their spurs chinking against ice-crusted snow. Granger moved away from the window, his hand resting on his pistol grip. "Back door," Granger whispered. "We can reach the barn before they surround the house." Thomas grabbed his coat and followed Granger through the kitchen. The back door opened silently, its hinges recently oiled. They crept across the yard, keeping low behind a wooden fence until they reached the barn's side entrance. Behind them, heavy boots climbed the front porch steps. Inside the barn, Granger pulled away hay bales with desperate efficiency. "Help me move these crates. If they find what's underneath, we're both dead men." Thomas lifted one corner of a heavy wooden crate and felt his muscles strain. The weight was wrong for surveying equipment. Metal clinked softly inside as they shifted it aside, revealing a trap door cut into the barn floor. Granger lifted the wooden panel, exposing a ladder descending into darkness. "Your uncle wasn't just surveying for minerals," Granger said, climbing down first. "He found them." The underground chamber stretched beneath half the barn, its walls carved from solid rock. Oil lamps flickered on tables covered with geological charts. But Thomas barely noticed the maps. Against the far wall, burlap sacks sat in neat rows, each one split open to reveal contents that caught the lamplight like captured starfire. Gold ore, rich with veins of pure metal, filled dozens of containers. The consortium hired Jeremiah to map mineral deposits on federal land, Granger explained quickly. But when he discovered this vein running beneath both federal and private property, he realized something they hadn't. "The richest part crosses under your ranch, legally yours." Thomas lifted a handful of ore, feeling its substantial weight. "How much is here?" "Enough to buy half the territory." Granger began stuffing samples into a leather satchel. But Jeremiah made a mistake. He started extracting without telling them about the boundary survey error. When they figured out what he was doing, a gunshot exploded above them, followed by the sound of splintering wood. The barn doors had been forced open. Heavy footsteps moved across the floor overhead, directly above their hiding place. "They found the trap door," someone called out in a gravelly voice. "Bring the rope." Granger extinguished the lamps, plunging them into absolute darkness. "There's another way out," he whispered. "Tunnel connects to the creek bed, but we can't take much gold with us." Thomas filled his coat pockets with the richest ore samples, while Granger gathered the geological surveys. Above them, men argued about the safest way to descend into an unknown space. A rope dropped through the trapdoor opening, followed by the scrape of boots against wood. "Time to go," Granger said, leading Thomas toward a narrow opening in the rock wall. "But understand something. Once we leave here, there's no coming back. They'll destroy everything to hide the evidence." The tunnel barely allowed them to crawl single file through jagged rock that scraped their backs with every movement. Thomas's knees found every sharp stone as they inched forward in complete darkness, the ore samples in his pockets cutting into his ribs. Behind them, muffled shouts echoed from the underground chamber as the consortium men discovered the extent of Jeremiah's operation. Water dripped steadily ahead, each drop landing with a hollow splash that grew louder as they progressed. The tunnel sloped downward, and Thomas felt cold air moving across his face. Granger stopped suddenly, causing Thomas to bump against his boots. "Creek bed opens up ahead," Granger whispered. "But they'll have men positioned there too. Your uncle didn't die from fever like everyone claimed. They caught him trying to move gold through this same tunnel." Thomas felt ice form in his chest that had nothing to do with the temperature. "You knew he was murdered?" "I helped him plan the extraction. When he didn't meet me at our arranged time, I found his body in the creek, weighted down with rocks." Granger's voice carried guilt that Thomas could hear even through the whisper. "I should have warned you sooner, but I thought if you just took their offer and left." A gunshot rang out from somewhere above ground, followed by another. The sound of hoofbeats circled the barn area, then spread out across the property. They were systematically searching every possible escape route. Granger pushed forward until pale light filtered down from the tunnel opening. They emerged into a creek bed lined with ice, the water running black beneath a thin, frozen crust. Cottonwood trees provided some cover, but Thomas could see riders moving between the trunks, their horses breathing steam in the bitter air. "We stay in the water," Granger said, pulling out his pistol. "Harder for them to track us, and the current will carry away our scent if they brought dogs." They waded upstream, ice-cold water soaking through their boots and numbing their feet within minutes. Thomas concentrated on maintaining his footing on the slippery rocks, but his mind raced with the implications of what they had discovered. The gold vein Jeremiah had found could establish mining claims worth thousands, enough to challenge the consortium's illegal operations on federal land. A horse nickered nearby, close enough that Thomas could hear its rider dismount. Granger motioned for absolute silence as they pressed against the creek bank beneath overhanging ice formations. Through the trees, Thomas saw a man in a dark coat examining the ground near the tunnel entrance. The rider called out to someone else. "Found where they came out. Tracks lead upstream, but the water's moving too fast to follow much further." Another voice answered from a greater distance. "Johnson's covering the bridge crossing. They can't get far on foot in this weather." Granger touched Thomas's arm and pointed upstream to where the creek curved around a rock formation. If they could reach that point unseen, the terrain would provide better cover for their escape. But the distance required crossing an open stretch where any movement would be visible to the searchers. Thomas felt the weight of the gold ore in his pockets and realized their survival might depend on a choice his uncle had faced: keep the evidence that could expose the conspiracy, or sacrifice it to save their lives. Thomas made his decision in the space between heartbeats. He pulled the heaviest gold samples from his pockets and pressed them into Granger's hands. "Take these to the territorial marshal. Tell him about the illegal mining operation and my uncle's murder. The ore samples are proof enough to start an investigation." Granger stared at the gold, understanding the weight of what Thomas was proposing. "What about you?" "I'm going back." Thomas checked his pistol, ensuring the cylinder was fully loaded. "They think they can destroy the evidence and disappear. But that underground chamber contains enough documentation to expose their entire operation. Mining surveys, geological charts, extraction records. Everything needed to prosecute them. That's suicide. There are at least 5 of them, and they know you're coming." Thomas smiled grimly. "They also think I'm running scared through the wilderness. Sometimes the last place anyone expects you is exactly where they just drove you from." He waited until Granger disappeared around the creek bend, then began working his way back toward the ranch. The consortium men had spread out to cover escape routes, leaving fewer guards near the barn. Thomas could hear them calling to each other through the trees, coordinating their search pattern as they moved further from the property. The barn stood partially open, wisps of smoke rising from the trapdoor opening. They had started a fire in the underground chamber, trying to destroy Jeremiah's records. Thomas circled to the back of the building, where a small window provided access to the hayloft. He climbed through carefully, his boots finding purchase on stored hay bales. Below, 2 men worked frantically to feed papers into a metal barrel that served as a makeshift furnace. Geological surveys curled and blackened in the flames, but they were working through the documents slowly, checking each page before destroying it. Thomas could see they had only burned through a fraction of Jeremiah's extensive records. One of the men wiped sweat from his forehead. "Boss wants this finished before the marshal arrives. Someone in town might have heard the gunshots." "Then work faster," his companion replied. "Soon as we're done here, we torch the whole barn and ride out. Nobody'll ever prove what happened." Thomas drew his pistol and aimed carefully through the loft opening. "Step away from that barrel." Both men spun toward his voice, reaching for their weapons. Thomas fired twice, the shots echoing deafeningly in the enclosed space. The first man stumbled backward against the rock wall, clutching his shoulder. The second dropped his pistol and raised his hands. "Kick the weapons away," Thomas ordered, climbing down the ladder. "Now sit against that wall and don't move." Outside, shouts indicated the other consortium members had heard the gunshots and were returning to the barn. Thomas grabbed an armload of unburned surveys and geological charts, stuffing them into a grain sack. The documentation represented legal proof of the conspiracy and evidence of his uncle's murder. Heavy footsteps approached the barn entrance. Thomas had what he needed, but now he faced the challenge of staying alive long enough to deliver it to the proper authorities. Thomas heard riders approaching the barn from multiple directions, their horses snorting in the cold air as they converged on his position. He secured the grain sack full of documents across his chest and checked the wounded consortium member, who was conscious but in no condition to cause trouble. The uninjured man sat motionless against the wall, his eyes fixed on Thomas's pistol. "Your friends are about to walk into a situation they can't control," Thomas told him. "The territorial marshal is already on his way here with a federal warrant. Your operation is finished." The man's face went pale. "You're bluffing. No one knows about this place. Granger reached town an hour ago with gold samples and a full confession about my uncle's murder," Thomas lied smoothly. "Right now, federal agents are reviewing geological surveys that prove your consortium has been illegally extracting minerals from government land." Heavy boots approached the barn entrance, but instead of charging in, the footsteps stopped. Voices carried through the wooden walls as the remaining consortium members argued about their next move. They could hear their wounded companion groaning inside, but they couldn't be certain what had happened or who controlled the situation. "Johnson," one of them called out. "You alive in there?" Thomas pressed his pistol against the uninjured man's temple. "Tell them you're fine, but that the situation has changed. Tell them the marshal's riders are coming up the main road." The man hesitated, then called out in a shaky voice, "We got problems out here. Federal agents coming from town. Boss says we need to clear out now." Silence followed, then rapid discussion among the men outside. Thomas heard saddles creaking as they remounted their horses. Within minutes, the sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance as the consortium members fled rather than face federal prosecution. Thomas waited another hour before emerging from the barn, the sack of evidence secured to his horse. The ride to town took most of the day, but when he arrived at the marshal's office, Granger was waiting with 2 federal agents who had been investigating illegal mining operations throughout the territory. The geological surveys and extraction records provided exactly the evidence they needed. Within a week, arrest warrants were issued for the entire consortium leadership. The federal government reclaimed the illegally mined gold and established proper mining claims for the area, with Thomas receiving legal title to the portion of the vein that crossed his inherited property. 6 months later, Thomas stood in the same barn where his ordeal had begun, but now it bustled with legitimate mining equipment and workers extracting gold under proper federal permits. The underground chamber had been expanded into a full mining operation, generating enough revenue to transform the entire region. Cora Lane approached him as he reviewed the daily production reports. "Your uncle would be proud," she said. "He always believed the truth would come out eventually." Thomas nodded, watching his workers load ore onto wagons bound for the territorial mint. The ranch buried in snow had indeed hidden something that defied logic, just not in the way anyone expected. Sometimes the most valuable discoveries lay not in what could be taken, but in what was worth fighting to protect. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable Western tale, where secrets buried in the frontier challenge everything you thought possible. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.